Okay, well, we are about 1 minute to go. So welcome, everyone. My name is Dr. Rehotsofetse Chigane, and welcome to the AKF webinar on Confronting Division, Global Leadership in an Era of Rising Polarization. We have a really exciting conversation ahead of us today. And I've been having a few chats with the individuals who I'll introduce fairly shortly after Sean's remarks. And there's a little buzz of excitement amongst us, and I hope that translates into the room today. My role today is simply to facilitate today's discussion, and MC, and hopefully facilitate a really invigorating conversation. More often than not, when we have these types of discussions, it sparks a lot of debate. It sparks a lot of emotions because there's so much uncertainty in this world right now. And I hope this conversations such as these create a level of certainty, a level of mandates that we need to really tackle some of these issues around polarization that is not just unique to South Africa or the United States or Canada or any other country, but it's really become this global phenomenon. And there's a need for us to kind of get to grips with it. So I want to welcome you all today, taking your Human Rights Day to come to a webinar in particular. We are very grateful as AKF. And not to delay anything any further, I would like to introduce our Executive Director of the Ahmed Kathrada Foundation, Nishan Bolton, to give some opening remarks and a welcome from the foundation.
Good evening and good afternoon or good morning to everybody. It's a huge honor and privilege to be welcoming all of you to this very important discussion. In South Africa, we mark it with Human Rights Day. Across the world, it's basically the International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, or Global Anti-Racism Day. Last week, Sunday, the Kathrada Foundation, the Department of Justice, the Human Rights Commission, and others were in Sharpeville, and we were standing at the gravesites of many of those who were killed on this day in 1960. And while standing there, all of those young people who were with us got to understand just the violence of racism and the consequences of racism. In that it led to not only the killing of what we thought were 69 people, but in fact, recent history has shown that it is perhaps much more than that. So it's a very significant day for us and for many across the world. I just want to make a few comments and just draw from a speech that Ahmed Kathrada made at the United Nations on this day, I think 2016 or 2015, addressing the UN on racism. And Kathrada says that in his speech, he talks about racism and says once it has contaminated the minds of otherwise sensible people, racism can be maddeningly stubborn and unresponsive to logic. It has shaped our history and that of the world. It guides the present in powerful ways. It continues to dictate and influence the type of people we live near, go to school with, and tolerate, friend, love, marry, hate, fight, and kill. It also influences our decisions about which people we help or neglect in times of need. In short, he says, racism squanders human potential. And then he reflects on his visit to Auschwitz and basically has the same sentiment as we had visiting the Sharpeville Cemetery. He addresses the report of the special rapporteur that had come out in 2006. And he says in that report, the report had drawn attention to the resurgence of racist violence amongst neo-Nazi groups and concludes that those groups have benefited from the regression of the fight against racism. And that report, which I'm sure we'll hear more about today, states that They have literally emerged from the backwoods of marginality by taking part in public demonstration and events, and made possible by the democratic legitimization of racist and xenophobic ideas. And that for us, I think, is the fundamental challenge today. That racists, right-wing conservatives have understood the importance of political power and political office. And once in office, they would design government and government systems and all that that power enables them to do to change things and change them fundamentally. Kathrada then goes on to talk about the Durban Declaration, as important as it was, and how little it has actually contributed to the global fight against racism. That there was a lot of commitment in theory, but very little in practice. And talks about the need for an alternative vision to a racist world, and calls for it, um, and talks about the need for the possibilities, thinking about the possibilities of whether we would get better long-term results if we were able to get a global anti-racism network to, amongst others, focus on anti-racism education and training in all schools across the world. It is the youth whom we must educate to prevent from repeating the foolishness of their parents. And then he makes, for me, perhaps the most fundamental point. I have struggled to find the green piece of anti-racism today. He says, while there are many good and effective local and national anti-racism organizations, I am not aware of a global civil society movement against racism and discrimination. He concludes, perhaps we have paid too much attention to governments and their roles and not sufficient to those closest to the people in civil society. And goes on to repeat Mandela's words at the Rivonia trial, that he was prepared to face the death penalty in pursuit of the ideals of a free and non-racial society, and asks whether many of the leaders that we have today in and out of government would be prepared to make the same commitment if required of them. And that, I think, draws us to the fundamental challenge of today's discussion, which Rikhotso Fetse, who is a board member of the foundation, will facilitate. Rikhotso Fetse is also a senior lecturer at the Wits School of Governance and a director at the Tiarasha Center for Digital Governance. He is a political commentator and an author, and is a researcher as well. He was previously the deputy chairperson of the Defender of Democracy movement in South Africa, and his research now focuses on decolonial thought, digital public infrastructure, and a whole range of other important areas of work. But fundamentally, Rikhotso Fetse is an activist. And is an activist that we think will make a major contribution to the future direction of this country. Over to you, Rikhotso Fetse.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Sean. That's a lot of pressure to put on me at that point. And we've got such big shoes to fill, and I'm really inspired by the individuals that we have speaking to us today. We have 4 really esteemed speakers. We will have a keynote address from Dr. Ashwini KP, who's the sixth special rapporteur on contemporary forms of racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance. She was appointed by the Human Rights Council in October of 2022 and took up her functions as the special rapporteur on the 1st of November. I imagine her day job or her other job is to also be an assistant professor of political science, where research really focuses on social exclusion, intersectionality, race, and descent-based discrimination in international human rights frameworks. Apart from her research, she is also just a good old-fashioned activist, as many of us in this room are, and her work is primarily focused on policies related to marginalized communities like Dalit and indigenous communities in India. We're really excited to have Dr. Ashwini KP, whose work has really transcended international borders. She'll be providing us with about 20 minutes of her keynote address, where she'll hopefully be speaking on this report that Sean had touched on, amongst other issues that I think she really wants us to be aware of on this special day. Thereafter, we will have inputs from our other speakers. This is Eric Ward, Melissa Levin, and Ashil Mbembe, but I'll introduce them when the time comes. Dr. Ashvini KP, we are really excited and honored to have you here in this room today. I hand it over to you.
Thank you so much, and it's an absolute honor to be here. Distinguished speakers, members of Hamad Kathrada Foundation, dear moderator, and everyone joining from different parts of the world, greetings from India. I believe that it is extremely necessary for us to be talking about racism and racial discrimination, and I would like to thank you for creating this space for reflection and dialogue, at a time when division is shaping our public life, personal life across many societies. And the theme of this conversation, confronting division, and strengthening leadership in the era of, when we speak of rising polarization, particularly, it's not just timely, but I strongly believe it's also necessary. And across regions, communities, we have seen how ethnically and racially marginalized communities have been facing extreme exclusion, and across regions and communities, this facing growing tension, majorly rooted in race, ethnicity, religion, caste, and various other markers of identity. And these tensions are not new, but the scale and the intensity in which they are expressed today, I strongly believe that it needs serious attention. And the purpose of this engagement is to reflect on racism, racial discrimination, or xenophobia, within the broader context of political and social polarization. And these are not isolated problems, these are deeply connected to political narratives, economic anxieties of the privileged communities across the globe, historical injustice, and the way in which institutions respond or fail to respond to the inequity that's happening across the globe. Across many countries, while we look at particularly in the context of migration or immigration, these narratives have strongly, embedded in the way in which racism or racial discrimination operates. They are produced, repeated, and amplified through political campaigns, media platforms, and social networks. And these narratives also gain a lot of legitimacy. And when I say narrative, it is the white supremacist narrative. It is the narrative of ethnically or racially marginalized communities. And these narratives gain legitimacy. Discrimination becomes easier to justify, particularly for the privileged communities, and exclusion particularly becomes much easier to implement. And racism and racial discrimination, when remain among the most persistent structures shaping inequality across the globe. And despite decades of international commitments, I believe that the lived experience of many communities show that race continues to determine the access to rights, opportunities, and most importantly, protection. And the persistence of these patterns remind us that racism is not only a matter of individual prejudice, which time and again experts and academicians have reiterated in their work. It's also embedded in institutions, policies, social attitudes that have developed over a long period of history. So when we speak of racism, we cannot ignore the legacies of colonialism, slavery, segregation, and various other systems of racial hierarchy that continues to shape the contemporary societies. And today, the manifestations of racism has also changed in a most complex, and it poses serious challenges to many of us who confront and who try to delegitimize racism. And many institutions were formed during this period when exclusion was legally sanctioned or socially accepted. Even after formal legal equality or legality was established, the deeper structures of inequality did not disappear, maybe to a certain extent, but it continues to stay. They continue to influence various spaces. And when we speak particularly in the context of polarization, and today, while we see a large wave of rise of right-wing governments across the globe, and at the same time, we are also witnessing the emergence of neo-Nazi groups across the globe. And the primary agenda is um, uh, white supremacy. The primary agenda is also anti-immigration or anything to do with anti-ethnically, racially marginalized communities. And today, when we speak of polarization, and this has created conditions in which these historical inequalities are often ignored or often dismissed, and instead of addressing the structural injustice, public debates are frequently shifting towards blaming communities, or trying to make these problematic, inappropriate or racist narratives, which has time and again benefited the privileged communities across the globe. For just to give you an example, migrants can be blamed for economic insecurity, which is very, very typical of how white supremacist groups operate. Religious minorities are portrayed as threats to national culture, and all of this reflects from offline to online structures as well. And in this context, racism and xenophobia are not simply social attitudes, they have also become political tools. And the narrative of fear and resentment are used to mobilize support, to consolidate power, particularly in political spaces, and redirect this public frustration away from these systemic issues. And when we speak particularly in the context of technological advancement, it's also important for us to see how the new manifestations of racism has had a lot of impact with technological advancement, be it artificial intelligence, rise of social media platforms. And particularly when we speak of digital platforms, social media platforms have also played a major role in shaping the landscape of the public discourse on racism and racial discrimination. And while digital communication has, we have to acknowledge that it has expanded opportunities for participation or connection, and to provide access to many, many marginalized communities in terms of gaining that social capital. It has also accelerated the spread of hate speech and misinformation against ethnically and racially marginalized communities. Messages that dehumanize communities, question their belonging, or even, call for exclusion. And these are circulated widely and rapidly, and particularly in online spaces. Often, it often mirrors and amplifies the offline discrimination. It can be racial abuse, misogyny, Islamophobia, anti-blackness, colorism, the xenophobic rhetoric. All of this is circulated at an extremely alarming speed, and these forms of hate speech do not remain confined to digital environment alone. They also influence real world attitudes, policies, and it translates into real life violence. And at the same time, when we look at how civil society organizations, human rights defenders, journalists, community leaders, all of them continue to tirelessly challenge these patterns. Their work has often, takes place under such difficult circumstances. And in many contexts, while we speak of racism and racial discrimination, there's also the manner in which intimidation, harassment, and legal restrictions has been targeted towards like-minded individuals has also changed its pattern. And all of this reminds us that confronting racism is not only about addressing harmful narratives, it's also about protecting the people and institutions who also work to uphold equality, or speak about the legacies of colonialism, segregation, and slavery. And particularly in this context, the concept of global leadership is extremely important. And while I work with the UN and closely work with a lot of civil society groups, academicians, it is extremely disheartening to see the state of affairs, particularly at the international platform. And the political development across the globe, particularly the states which have the most space at United Nations or even various other international platforms have time and again negated the importance of rising the issue of racism, racial discrimination, or if it is done, it is always done in a manner in which it is more symbolic and not in a comprehensive approach. And at this point of time, there is a need of responsible leadership, which also requires clarity in recognizing racism and racial discrimination. And the most important aspect is also about representation, and we often see that representation of Black community, ethnically marginalized community, often remains symbolic, and this remains as one of the challenges for individuals to speak about racism, to share their lived experiences. And at the same time, there's also a serious lack of disaggregated data. And while we work on, as academicians, we work on a massive, amount of theory and various other things, a lot of quantitative data, a lot of testimonies where we listen to the lived experiences of ethnically and racially marginalized communities. It is also important, and there is an attempt to appropriate these experiences, which needs to be challenged and questioned. And communities across the world continue to share these testimonies, the barriers to employment, it be it unequal treatment to education. All of these need a space where it is recognized and where it is addressed in a more substantial manner. And in the context of international human rights framework, we have seen there are many conventions, declarations, anti-racism mechanisms have been established, and the commitment and the aim and agenda behind establishing these mechanisms has been very clear, that there has to be a strong space to address racism and racial discrimination. But these frameworks are also a result of years of struggle of movements, communities, leaders across the globe. But yet we see that commitments which are on papers do not translate into meaningful change on ground, and laws and policies must be implemented effectively, which we often don't see. And at the same time, we also see it's important to also speak about the public memory. And I think this is something which is very much necessary in the context of racism and racial discrimination, that in the last many years, there is a serious attempt to erase the histories of the Black community across the globe. And if I have to mention specifically, it's about the United States of America, and there is a clear attempt to erase, the stories, the histories, the symbols, the structures which belong to the struggles of Black community, and be it monuments, museums, public commemoration. All of these reflects how the history itself has been, has been built, and how the communities have grown and evolved. And today, at this point of time, when we rethink about how racism has evolved, or when we rethink about how racial discrimination has been spoken about, I think it is extremely important for us to go beyond words, go beyond these institutions, and the most important dimension within understanding racism is also how we apply the concept of intersectionality. And this is something that has been raised time and again, particularly within the ethnically and marginalized communities. And this is something that several academicians and several experts at international platforms have time and again mentioned. And just to conclude, I would say that particularly in the recent past, the discussion on rising polarization, or and divisions that makes clear that racism and racial discrimination, all of this are remain deeply embedded in many societies. These issues are not only matters of individual behavior, but we have to time and again see that these are issues that are structural, that are historical, and that have in the recent time have manifested in different ways. And the counter narrative to the existing racism and racial discrimination or xenophobia has to be much more different. The language of anti-racism has to be much more different, and the language of anti-racism should come from people, from individuals, from communities who have been at the receiving end and who have experienced racism. And confronting these challenges, I believe that we require consistent commitment and accountability and representation, and without which it is extremely difficult and challenging for us to understand what racism is. I think it is high time that communities, the affected communities, lead the movement. The affected communities are at the forefront in addressing racism and racial discrimination. And this has to be one of the core aims and core ethos of the movement's anti-racism movement, as well as spaces, various international spaces, various civil society groups where we speak of anti-racism and or we are addressing racism or racial discrimination. I'll stop here. Thank you so much for your patience and listening to me. I'm happy to listen to your comments and answer your questions. Thank you again.
No, thank you so much. I mean, you've left us with a lot to like ponder and think about, and I hope the following speakers will follow with the same energy that you gave, and especially this point about finding new ways of countering racism, of countering polarization, finding new discourses, because those who are racist evolve the way that they spew their discrimination, and there's a need for us to really think carefully about how do we evolve, how do we get better, how do we stay one step ahead and not just be reactive to it. I would like to welcome our next speaker from the United States, Eric Ward, and I'm really excited to welcome him to this space today. Eric Ward has spent the majority of the last 2 decades. You said 2 decades, Eric. I assume now it's almost 3 decades at this point. Working in rural and urban communities across the United States of America, essentially countering bigoted violence and hate organizing. He is the only US recipient of the Civil Courage Prize, an international award that honors steadfast resistance to evil at very great personal cost. And from 2011 to about 2017, he also worked inside the Atlantic Philanthropies and the Ford Foundation, really supporting different efforts and strategies that advance universal rights and inclusive democracy. Eric Ward is the executive vice president of Race Forward, and I'm sure he will tell us a bit more about the organization, and a senior fellow at the Southern Poverty Law Center and co-producer of the documentary White with Fear, which right after this, I'm going to try and find and watch this evening, I think. I would like to warmly welcome you, Eric. We are very grateful for your time, and off to you.
It's such an honor, and thank you, and deep thanks to the Ahmed Cathadra Foundation for the invitation and for hosting this conversation on a day that demands honesty from all of us. As we know, it is the International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. In South Africa, it is also Human Rights Day, and that matters because this day comes to us through Sharpeville, through blood, through the truth that racism is never only about prejudice. It is also about power. It is about who the state protects, who it suspects, who it humiliates, and who it teaches the public to fear. So I want to begin plainly today. I'm the executive vice president of Race Forward. We are a national racial justice organization in the United States, about 35 years old. And we work on the question not of belonging, but of governance. For many of us within Race Forward, we believe that the question of belonging in the United States was settled in 1968. Even though there are some who choose to try to have a 2 out of 3, as we call it, the idiom of if you don't like the outcome, try to force it again. Race Forward rejects that, and we ask a different question. Will a multiracial America be allowed to govern an inclusive democracy, or will it not? we feel we have received the response to that. The United States, I would say to those listening, to understand, it is not a struggling democracy going through a difficult political season. It is in a fight now over whether democracy can be established in the United States as a lived reality. We still have elections, we still have courts, but those facts no longer settle the question in the United States. Reuters recently has reported on the efforts of the Trump administration to weaken federal judges, on the physical threats aimed at judges, and on court battles over sweeping executive actions by the president and funding freezes. Those are not ordinary signs of democratic health. They are warning signs. And because today is about racial discrimination, I want to be even more direct. In the United States, race is not the side issue inside this crisis. Race is the paper that this whole story is written on. And we are in a moment because of changing generational demographics, changing demographics within the US domestic human rights movement, that fact that race is the singular lens upon which this is playing out has been lost. You cannot understand American authoritarianism without understanding the backlash against Black progress. What we are seeing is not a revolution, but a counter revolution to 65 years of civil rights gains based in the idea of a multiracial democracy. And that is why I return to the Black radical tradition, not as a slogan, not as a romance, but as a Black-led tradition that argues again and again that universally protected rights and liberties inside a multiracial democracy are the only fair answer to discrimination and othering and bias. If rights are not real for the most targeted, they are not secure for anyone else. That is the American loop. Expand belonging, then punish it, and call the punishment safety. Reconstruction, right? Post-Civil War in the United States builds a multiracial government. Then Jim Crow, the segregation of Black people legally, rips it out. The Civil Rights era broadens the democratic horizon once again. Then Black leaders and their allies are targeted by state repression through a program called COINTELPRO. After September 11th, Muslim communities are treated as suspect in the name of security. In our own time, Black Lives Matters protests are recast as disorder, and honest teaching about history is pushed out of schools. This is not random. It is a system, and at the center of today's version of that system sits something called white nationalism. White nationalism is a political ideology that does not seek to exploit communities of color or women or resources. It seeks to rid the United States of all communities of color and immigrants and its Jewish population. Inside of that sits anti-Semitism as a story engine. Too many people still treat anti-Semitism like a side issue. It is not. It gives authoritarian politics the hidden narrative it needs. It says, in short, change is not democratic struggle, it is manipulation. It says inclusion is not progress, it is a plot. If we don't name that issue in the US, we leave it running. And if we leave it running, it keeps doing its work. It wedges two of our most powerful communities in the United States, Jews and Muslims, right? Jews and Arabs, Black and Jewish communities, immigrants and long settled communities. It takes real grief and real fear and reorganizes it into suspicion. Trumpism did not invent that machine, it scaled it. And now it no longer is only oppositional, it is governing. It is testing which institutions will yield, which communities can be isolated, and which rules can be bent without consequence. Recently, it was reported that the threatened use of the Insurrection Act in Minnesota after neighbors stood up to protect their immigrant neighbors over federal immigration enforcement surges was significant. And we know that this also turned into physical attacks on Minnesotans, including the shooting deaths of 3 individuals and the injury to hundreds, if not thousands more. That is the administrative power of the Trump administration being trained on vulnerable communities in real time. I want to name some things very quickly here. First, repression of protest is happening. Protest is being recorded and is being recoded as a public threat. Second, hate violence. Hate violence, particularly between Muslim and Jewish and Black communities, are at all-time highs. Hate violence does not just move through policy, it moves through atmosphere, through permission, through the feeling that some people have become fair game. A corrupted Federal Bureau of Investigation and U.S. Department of Justice means that we no longer have reliable data on just how many incidences are actually happening out there versus what is being reported. But looking at independent institutions, we get a sense that hate crimes continue to surge. Third, the wedge. One of the central projects of this period in the authoritarian movement in the United States is to make communities that should be learning how to govern together experience one another as permanent threats. In the US, we are working hard to try to manage that internal tension with humiliation, without erasure, and without every conflict becoming a loyalty test. Because when we do, authoritarians win even before they have begun to make their full move. Now, I want to quickly, in closing, look beyond the US borders. We should all remember that the US State Department is one of the most resourced entities in the world. And that well-resourced entity has now weaponized its dollars under the Trump administration, not to build international cooperation, but to even more consciously seed division and authoritarian movements outside the United States. This same administration is normalizing exception at home, right? But it's also stretching power abroad. Whether we're talking about the US combat operations in Venezuela or the widening war posture with Iran, what we are seeing is that US authoritarian politics will not stay in the US. It travels as law, money, culture, and permission, and at a scale that none of us will have seen before. So what do we do, particularly for international friends? The first is to stop treating what is happening in the US as business as usual or a minor blip. We should stop assuming federal elites are where democratic stability lives. It lives on the ground, within the grassroots, at local levels. We are in a period now where we are not a symbolic march on Washington. This is tens of thousands of local communities, each waging their own civil rights struggle on behalf of racial justice. Second, we should insist that foreign-based companies doing business in the United States or with the United States meet basic human rights standards and anti-discrimination laws and labor obligations that they are expected to stand by in their countries of origin. We should not let them lower their standards on American soil just because political winds are darkening. Third, we should take a hard look at the World Cup and the coming Olympics. We should not be treating them as neutral spectacles. We should be asking what type of policing, surveillance, exclusion, and political intimidation is functioning in American society and being normalized around these events, and who pays the cost. Fourth, we should invest in international exchange with US racial justice leaders who are increasingly isolated and being vilified here at home. That includes local organizers, journalists, local elected officials, educators, faith leaders, cultural artists who are still trying to make democracy real from the ground up. If we want to stand with American democracy because we understand its influence around the world, we need to stand with Americans still trying to build one. I'll end here. Again, I'm really grateful. But on this day, we need a global call, almost a reckoning for those who embrace human rights. And we should do it by setting one test that we can live by. It's a single question. Can the most targeted person in my own community move through public life with rights intact and dignity untouched, even when tempers are high? If the answer is no, what we know is authoritarianism has room to grow. And if it has room to grow, US foreign policy will seek to invest in it. If the answer becomes yes as a matter of routine, the American autocratic script will begin to fail abroad and at home. That's the standard I'm arguing for on this day. I think that is the discipline this moment demands, and that is the United States I'm asking the world to recognize, support, and struggle alongside. Not the mythology, not the performance, not the empire flattering itself in public. The one still fighting to become a multiracial democracy worthy of the name. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Ward. I mean, you've left me with quite a bit to think about. There was three particular points that you made. The first around how the rising white nationalism is testing our institutions and testing if they will yield or not. And we can see that in the South African context as well. It gives me this insight of this idea that these ideas and beliefs from the past that we thought we left in the past, that we find these new advocates for them, trying to not just make them part of the present, but something as to take forward into the future. And that's kind of stuck with me. And I also appreciate your words around finding support and not giving up faith in the United States, and knowing that there are people within the United States who are constantly advocating for change. And often becomes really easy to just kind of say the United States, we're washing our hands, we don't know what will happen, and we see the consequences of it. So I deeply appreciate your contributions. I would like to now welcome Dr. Melissa Levin, who I've been wanting to meet for a very long time. I didn't mention this before, because of your connections in the United States with the Ahmed Kathrada Foundation. But maybe we'll have our own conversation at some point. But Dr. Levin is an assistant professor in African Studies and New College at the University of Toronto. She serves on the executive committee of the SSHRC-funded Participedia project and co-chairs the Human Rights Cluster. She also serves on the board of the North American Friends of the AKF and was a founder member of the Jewish Faculty Network in Canada. She has most recently co-edited a special journal issue, the Journal of Curriculum and Pedagogy, focused on democratic pedagogies in particular. Her other academic research focuses on institution building, memorialization, and nationalisms. And I'm very, very excited to welcome you to address us today, to also give us your thoughts and opinions and beliefs, and maybe a bit of insight about what's happening in Canada when it comes to issues of polarization. So I hand it off to you, Dr. Levin.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the introduction. I must tell you, I am thoroughly intimidated to speak after that really brilliant intervention. Well, those two very brilliant interventions. But let me offer some thoughts, and hopefully we'll be able to tease these out in conversation and particularly think about strategies for the way forward. But just to say, it really is my honor to be here to participate in continuing the work of our late Uncle Kathy of Ahmed Kathrada, whose life's work has helped us build and imagine another better world. Thank you for having me here on this Human Rights Day, this National Human Rights Day, and this International Day for the Elimination of Racism. I'm from Benoni, by the way, just to situate myself, but I'm currently in Toronto, which is the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. This territory is supposed to be governed by the Dish with One Spoon Covenant, which signals the agreement to equitably share and care for this land. That is the sign we have in our windows after Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission adjudicated that the Canadian state enacted a cultural genocide against Indigenous people. I'm drawing the metaphor of the sign in the window from a recent speech that Mark Carney, Canada's Prime Minister, delivered in Davos. In that speech, Carney claimed that the international rules-based order is a myth produced and perpetuated by the powerful. He said it was time to shatter the pretense. Mark Carney, in the speech, seemed honest, enlightening, suggesting a new multilateralism led from the middle. But rather, for me, it articulated a kind of well-trod myth making of Canada as this kinder, gentler, non-warring foil to its belligerent and imperial neighbor. Canada is mythologized as the end of the Underground Railroad, as the global peacekeeper, as the place of multiculturalism. But Canada is a settler colonial state with an economy enriched through extraction from Africa, from here in Turtle Island and Latin America. It is in this context that racism can be read, and in this context that stimulates the conditions for the elaboration of polarization in this current moment. Prior to Canada becoming a state, papal bulls permitted the theft of Indigenous land here where I sit. African and Indigenous people enslaved by European companies and settlers labored to build this place that I live on now. Later, racist segregationist laws were enacted in Canada. Indigenous children were stolen from their families and placed in violent residential schools, or given to white families to raise as a tactic of assimilationist colonialism. Afriqueville in Nova Scotia was destroyed by the state in the 1960s. One Jew was one too many for the racist Canadian state to save from the Nazi Holocaust. Islamophobia in the last 25 years in particular has mushroomed around Canada. And we see this in the slaughter of Muslim worshippers in Ottawa at a mosque and the running down of a Muslim family in London, Ontario. The epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous women remains consistent in Canada to this day. To this day, in the province of Ontario where I live, and for the last 30 years, there are boil water advisories in First Nations territories because water is unsafe to drink and even to wash with. A number of years ago, Jagmeet Singh, who was the then leader of the Social Democratic NDP, promised in an election campaign expenditure of $6 billion to ensure clean water for Indigenous communities. A reporter asked him how he could justify such an expenditure that seemed ridiculous, $6 billion. Singh retorted that the journalist would never ask such a question had Toronto or Montreal been under boil water advisories. What Singh illuminated in that moment is the naturalized, taken for granted notion that some people can live in conditions of violence and deprivation when it would be unconscionable for those conditions to be the fate of others. What these many examples and a very brief historical sketch hint at is that polarization is not a new phenomenon, which we also heard in the first talk. Global and Canadian capitalism have been built in and through vicious colonial, racist, and misogynist endeavors. Perhaps what we have arrived at in this moment, at this juncture, is an end to the pretense that capitalism can be less ecocidal and genocidal when it is up against its limit. What politics do captains of industry like my Prime Minister turn to when faced with its contradictions? Carney suggests we pull down the sign rather than do what it takes to make that sign of international law and international human rights a lived reality. When we pull down the sign that claims a rule-based order that potentially defends the powerless, that potentially builds a more equitable world, his answer is to move on from its promise. So in its place, in Canada today, Carney's government moves against the Wet'suwet'en Nation to approve pipelines through their territory. His laws transform Indigenous land defenders into terrorists. His parliament voted against closing a loophole in the law to enable Canada to keep arming Israel. Massive increases in defense spending undermine Inuit sovereignty in the Arctic. And this is coupled with decreases in development aid spending for the rest of us. Racist policing continues to target Black and Indigenous people. There's a bill moving through Parliament right now that seeks to shut down protest, which is specifically targeted at anti-genocide protesters. The Canadian state regards protest and criticism of Israel and Zionism as being anti-Semitic, which makes the Canadian world today less safe for Palestinians who are the targets of Israeli state violence, and for Canadian Jews who, according to the state, are responsible for the actions of Israel. The Canadian state has also abandoned Cuba to empire's rapey wrath, for want of a better way to describe the attitude of the US to Cuba. The rhetoric of the moment is most clearly articulated by Marco Rubio. He's in his Ode to Colonialism and White Supremacy, which finds fertile soil north of the 49th parallel. That's here in Canada. The conservative opposition in Canada consistently alludes to this idea called Western civilization and to its opposite, barbarism. What has been astonishing to witness is the way in which anti-Semitism, and this goes back to the previous talk too, the way in which a kind of anti-Semitism has been mobilized in the defense of this idea. Western civilization, which if we are to establish its current iteration, and here Professor Mbembe will probably thoroughly undermine and dismiss what I'm about to say in his talk, but that's okay, we can debate this. If we to establish its current iteration begins with the Inquisition and expulsion of Jews and Muslims from Spain, conquest, genocide, and colonization of the Americas, and the enslavement of millions of African people. It continues through hundreds of years of conquest, produces race science that we're living with today, and the early genocides of the 20th century culminate in the Nazi genocide and the mass murder of the Jews of Europe. Western civilization against barbarism, placing Jews in its first line of defense, is cynical at best. I would contend that the polarization that we are witnessing now are polarized ideas, but don't just live in the realm of ideas, obviously live in the realm of everyday realities. But on the one side are the ideas that explain the world in essentialized racist categories, the fascist side in defense of end of days capitalism. And then there's the rest of us who are fighting for a better world and finding a multiplicity of ways to organize. In this world, there are many groups, organizations across Canada that are continuing the fight for a domination-free world, an egalitarian world, a world that Adam Getachew reminds us is the world for us to win. In reclaiming the markers of our struggles in our windows across Canada, the signs are not notes of our submission, but are declarations of our commitment to another politics. I will, in the conversation, speak to you about how some of those politics manifests in organization around Canada today, drawing specifically from the examples of the encampments that we had on our campuses, and particularly at the campus that I work on, the University of Toronto. I'm very eager to listen to different views and engage in further conversation on this. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Devon. You sparked a few thoughts. I mean, one of your opening remarks was around how in the past you had created this, the world had created the conditions for polarization. And you kind of went through this historical trip, kind of laying it out for us. And it got me thinking about what are the present conditions that are constantly being created that really give rise to polarization today as well. And I love the line around the multiplicity of different alternatives that we have that we need to kind of figure it out together. So, and I'm sure Prof. Mbembe will come back in whatever way he needs to come back in. But I think it's a profound point that you were making there, and one that resonates with me as well. I'd like to invite our final speaker before we open it up to everyone else. And again, I hope we have more of a discussion and conversation with each other rather than just hoping for the best and just having a question and answer at that point. But we will get there when we get there. I would like to invite Prof. Mbembe. Many of you in South Africa and many of you who are associated with AKF will know Prof. Mbembe is one of our board members. But he's also a globally renowned historian, political theorist, and a pioneering voice in post-colonial and critical theory. He's an author of influential works, from On the Post-Colony to Necropolitics, to Critique of Black Reason. And a lot of these pieces of writing examine colonial legacies, power, race, and global futures. His scholarship has provoked public debate and public engagement, and Prof. Mbembe has always been an advocate of earthly communities centered on justice, memory, and planetary ethic. And I'm very happy to say that he's also the head of the Innovation Foundation for Democracy. He sent me a note on it yesterday, and I got to read more about it. And if you haven't heard about it, I really hope that you can get in contact with him and the foundation to see the work that they're doing. Without further ado, I'd like to invite Prof. Mbembe to give us his remarks and comments, and then we will have a fun conversation amongst ourselves.
Thank you so much. I really don't have much to add to what we have already heard. And so what I will do is that I will restrict myself to a few broad comments in the hope of contributing to the conversation that will follow. The times we are living in are very difficult to characterize. But it seems to me that there are two instances, or in any case, two attempts at giving them somewhat of a name, which have been tried recently, and they were both mentioned by the previous speakers, in particular by Melissa and by Eric. The first such attempt at giving a name to the moment our world is going through comes from indeed the Canadian Prime Minister, who basically repeated, if you allow me the term, some of what a number of activists and intellectuals and even politicians in the global South have been claiming all along. When I say all along, I mean probably since the age of decolonization, since the 1960s, undertook the task of deconstructing the basic determinants of what we have taken as the liberal international order, which, as we know, logical point of view, on the concept of free trade and on the concept of liberal democracy. The communist alternative, early 90s. Of course, the basic foundations of the liberal international order were not just liberal democracy and free trade. The liberal international order also was grounded on not just the possibility, but the actual deployment, whenever necessary, of military force, which resulted in numerous wars in the first age of decolonization, and in a number of wars of counterinsurrection, a model which, as we know, has found a resurgence, in particular after the Gulf War and what came later on. But the liberal international order was also grounded on a kind of incipient structural foundational racism, which the genealogy of which we know very well. Melissa and Eric recalled it a moment ago. So the Prime Minister of Canada is basically expressing more of an agreement with the kind of critique people in the Global South have been making all along. Although, of course, he draws from it different conclusions, because if I followed him very well, his solution, the solution he offers in response to the fracturing of our world, that solution doesn't seem to me to be that far off what is really being implemented right now, so-called transactionalism. Then there was the speech delivered in Munich by the current US Secretary of State, Mr. Marco Rubio. Marco Rubio, in his speech, was basically giving a kind of official stamp to a number of half-baked ideas, which over the last quarter of a century, 25 years, have been advocated by ultra-right ideologists. Key to these ideas is, of course, the necessity, or in any case, the regret for having decolonized. Second is the call, the injunction to rehabilitate colonialism in its multiple forms, in terms of its racist impulse, racist foundations, the inequality between different human beings, inequality between, of course, different so-called cultures, hierarchy between those who matter and those who really don't. But colonialism also, and more importantly, in terms of the capacity to acquire, including by force, the riches of the earth, critical minerals in this sense, but also other natural resources necessary for the powering of an economic system which we know very well now has led fundamentally to the destruction of the earth, and has opened up the possibility rise to the possibility of extinction, since this is indeed the term. Thus, all the debates on the climate crisis, and so forth and so on, which in any case have to do with the impossibility or quasi impossibility we find ourselves in today that come to an end. So it seems to me that these two speeches somewhat they signal the depth of the crisis we found ourselves in. Sean was asking in the chat, okay, what possibilities of mastering a global coalition against racism, what possibilities are there today, and how we might begin to think about that. Eric responded to, gave us a number of ideas in that sense, Melissa too, and the previous speaker too. It seems to me that, of course, this is a key issue. It's not really easy to respond to the challenge Sean has put to us. It's not easy because answering it requires a renewal of thinking, of the paradigms, which somewhat have been at the basis of anti-racism struggles during, in any case, the period between 1960 and now. We definitely need to go back to the heritage of thinking that we have, most of which comes from the experience of the United States of America, a lot of which also comes from the South African experience. And I would like to foreground here the importance of the South African experience in the manner in which the global imagination of living in common in the world has unfolded, I would say, in the second half of the 20th century, and in the first years of the 21st. And in that sense, calling again, remembering Nelson Mandela, invoking once again Ahmed Kathrada, calling upon figures like Walter Sisulu, reactivating the memory of the anti-apartheid struggle and understanding it not necessarily as a national struggle, but as a global struggle. Doing all of that becomes absolutely important. It becomes important not only symbolically, but also strategically, but also philosophically, if you want. It becomes important because the world we see emerging out of the rubbles of the what I call the liberal international order, that world is in total contradiction with what these figures, Mandela, Sisulu, Kathrada, totally in contradiction with that. It's a world in which we see, more than maybe ever before, the contradiction between liberal democracy on the one hand and the form of, in the aftermath of the technological acceleration that we have witnessed, which hasn't really come to an end, which is unfolding, which is morphing into artificial intelligence, which means generalized automation of almost everything, including of our own very language, which opens up, of course, all kinds of questions about meaning, about why we are here, where we're going, etc. And which opens up, of course, terrible questions about the place of Africa in all of this. So just to conclude, I believe that we have to go back to what the struggle against apartheid actually meant in its materiality, but also deeply in terms of its meaning, in terms of its imagination of a world in common, of a planetary world, a world beyond borders, a world predicated not on formal democracy, but on substantive democracy, a form of democracy which would attend to the imperative of redress, of justice, in particular for those who, for over a long period of time, have been brutalized, and for those who are brutalized nowadays, migrants in particular. And here I cannot end my short comments without highlighting the issue of xenophobia, which is not a typical South African issue. It's everywhere. It manifests itself in many different ways. But in South Africa, of course, we have to read it in relation to the imperative of redress in a connected world, in a connected Africa in particular. And in doing so, we'll have to draw, hopefully, a number of principles which might help us in constructing global alliances in a world which today is really somewhat at large. I will end it here, and I would like to thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Prof. Mbembe. You've left us a lot to think about. And I want us to quickly move towards our kind of conversation and Q&A. So I have been, and it's mostly because I could give all my comments at this point, but you'll get very tired of my voice very quickly. We have a few questions that have come in the chat. I've also asked for permission to see if we can have people also verbalize their questions, if so be, which is a very dangerous thing to just randomly hand over the microphone without briefing someone beforehand. But if you have not seen the questions, and I think the best way to do it is you can answer any one of the questions as you best think you can. I might pose a few as well. So we have one question from Fenwal Ndebele about how best can political tolerance and anti-xenophobia be inculcated in societies. If you can answer that, you will solve many problems in the world very quickly. But I'm excited to hear your responses. And then the second question that we have is that we know that there are laws in place which are meant to help defend people discriminated against. However, within the South African context, and I imagine this applies globally as well, however, in the South African context, there seems to be a backlash in upholding these laws, not just politically, but in education and workplaces as well. How can this issue be further discussed and resolved? And that's from Olela Mpati in particular. And I think, Prof. Mbembe, you answered the question from Nishan. And I'll also kind of pose another question to the three of you, and we'll kind of go one by one and see how far we can go before we take the second round. And it's really this question around how do you think about polarization, as Dr. Ashwini mentioned, in this kind of technological age, right? Where almost paradoxically, the liberalization of freedom of speech has left us very vulnerable to certain individuals concentrating power who own these social media platforms, who determine the roles, who allow certain speech to exist. How do you even begin countering that when you can see there's this active move to concentrate power to control freedom of speech at a global level towards polarization? Because often it makes money and sometimes it's for nefarious means. And I'm curious to hear about your suggestions around countering that. So I'll start with Dr. Ashwini. There's these two questions. If we can keep it to about 2 minutes or so, and then hopefully we can squeeze in a second round of questions.
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much. I think it's one of the important questions in terms of addressing freedom of speech. And this idea of absolute freedom of speech has been challenging when we speak of anti-racism approach. Just to give you an example, I come from India, and then freedom of speech happens to be one of our fundamental rights in Indian Constitution. However, freedom of speech is not absolute. It is subjected to a certain kind of restriction owing to the historicity of caste-based discrimination, gender, patriarchy, and many other contexts. And I feel that there needs to be a certain level of regulation in terms of acknowledging racism, the legacies of colonialism, and there is a callous understanding of freedom of speech. I would say that. Freedom of anything that individuals speak cannot be freedom of speech. The harm that speech can cause, the harm that speech can translate, the words can translate into violence need to be acknowledged. And particularly in the context of social media, I would say that states across the globe have been extremely hostile towards addressing or engaging with social media platforms, including companies who are deeply engaged in artificial intelligence. And we're talking about companies whose primary goal is profit making, not human rights, and not even bare minimum human rights. And therefore, it is highly important at this point of time that states, governments across the globe take that bare minimum initiative to engage with technological companies so that their policies align with the government's with the country's law of the land, the bare minimum that one can ask. Because at the end of the day, many of our constitutions speak about equality, representation, diversity. And I think it is important for states to engage, but having engaged with many governments, several stakeholders across the globe, I see a strong resistance from governments to engage on human rights issues, on racism, on discrimination, particularly with social media platforms. And at this point of time, Mr. Eric Ward, when he mentioned about the situation of US, the situation seems to be grim when it comes to engaging with social media platforms and tech firms. But I'm still optimistic, and I think civil society groups and various other like-minded groups have done a phenomenal work. I think we should sustain this work to address polarization and the various other challenges in this context.
I mean, thank you for that. And you've mentioned Eric, and as you were speaking, I mean, Eric, I am not a constitutional expert of the United States. What I do know is that a vast majority of the amendments to your constitution were directly around the second question, around putting in place laws that protect people and defend people against discrimination. And I'm curious about how you rationalize this question of, even though the laws are in place, when you try and uphold these laws, there's backlash against you. And I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Absolutely. I mean, we should understand that rights in the United States have been a unfolding and evolving proposition, and much of it resides around the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which defines citizenship and the rights of belonging legally in this country. Most civil rights law is grounded in that 14th Amendment, which was passed in the midst of the U.S. Civil Rights, or sorry, the U.S. Civil War in the 1800s. It is currently now under attack, and there is a significant ruling this summer. But regardless of the law, here is what we understand. At the end of the day, the push for racial justice and, quite frankly, gender equity, the right to practice one's religion, you know, free from discrimination, resides not on the ability to convince a population that it should not be bigoted. That's important work. We have to continue to do education around bias, around the attempts of some cynical politicians and others to wedge marginalized communities in order to break power and the potential of coalitions. But at the end of the day, the real practice to promoting and defending belonging free from bias resides in laws and practices, understanding that all of us act in bias, and laws and practices are put into place to offset that bias. So I want to be clear. The goal isn't to rid American society or global society of bias. That is an ethical, moral proposition, one that I fully embrace. But the practice is the passage of laws and practices and statutes that offset the bias that each of us carries around, so that even if we carry that bias into a job interview, right, or into our work, these laws and practices offset that bias so that we are not impacting people's lives, their ability to live, love, worship, work, free from fear and bias. That has been the trajectory globally, but we are now facing a global backlash here in the United States, and then, of course, in other places around the world. I have a sense of why that is. In short, it's twofold. One is that those practices were showing results, right? And making everyone's lives better. Civil rights laws in the United States didn't just benefit Black folks, they benefited everyone, including white males, white females. Everyone was benefiting from this idea of inclusive governance. That practice, and I'm not here to draw fairy tales. I'm not saying everything is perfect, but it was better than it looked in 1865 and certainly better than 1765. The other piece, though, is that the ability to reduce bias in practice was allowing broader coalitions to build across lines of race, religion, gender. In short, the South African proposition of a multiracial society, Jesse Jackson's argument of a rainbow coalition, was actually occurring in practice. Not the majority of white folks, but a significant portion. And I think that this made people afraid that they were losing power, and hence the backlash. I always remember the fact that apartheid came to South Africa while there was the practice of discrimination and discounting of the indigenous people of South Africa. Apartheid becomes a system to manage demographic change, and we are watching something similar begin to take place in the United States.
I mean, thank you so much for that. And it's curious to see, I mean, how that keeps evolving as well. And Melissa, there's a very direct question to you, which from Nene Mulefi in the chat, which is, in your view, what is the single most transformative outcome of Canada's TRC? And I think as you're answering that, because of the way you're talking about the Prime Minister in Canada, about the policies in place, I think the second question there from Dumelo Zwane in particular, I think maybe you could link them, but no pressure, around what specific policies or initiatives can governments and institutions implement to promote constructive dialogue and reduce polarization. But there's a caveat there, especially amongst young people and young adults, who we can see this polarization almost at an extreme level in certain instances. So I'll let you go, and then I'll ask Achille Mbembe the final question for today.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much for those questions. Let me try and be brief, but also substantive. So as far as the Truth Commission is concerned, Nenia, so the Truth Commission in Canada follows and draws from the South African Truth Commission, except that its priority is to hear the stories of those who were of the survivors of residential schools, as opposed to those who were perpetrators of atrocities. So in that, I think, is probably its greatest strength, to the extent that we have a historical record that otherwise would not have existed. So the Truth Commission has provided us with that record. That record is being challenged. So when you have a historical record, it doesn't mean that it just lives in perpetuity as the record. So that record is challenged. We're fighting now with residential school denialists. That's kind of one of the nodes of racism in Canada today. But certainly kind of that historical record is key. Also, a kind of opening up of institutions for scrutiny is always important, as we're thinking about how do we transform institutions that have a tendency to reproduce themselves. So the TRC kind of opened up that possibility, because it kind of came out with, I think it's around 94 calls to action that are supposed to deal with prejudice and racism against Indigenous people. So transformative also might be too big an idea to fully, it was important, but maybe not transformative. But what I want to say here is, we kind of, I always go back to, I think it was the Communist Party in like 1994 in South Africa that had characterized South Africa's transition as a democratic opening. So, so we haven't achieved democracy, it's a democratic opening. And so, what do these, so the Truth Commission in Canada, I think also we can read as a kind of opening. It's not a resolution of anything, but it opens up possibility for engagement, further engagement. It creates the opportunities that might not have been there before the Truth Commission existed. So, a kind of a cynical way of reading the Truth Commission is that it's part of Canadian mythology. Like we did these terrible things and we're so sorry for them. Let's move on and be Canadian. So that would be the kind of cynical outcome. The other question on, sorry,
So the other question is policies or initiatives that governments and institutions implement to promote constructive dialogue and reduce polarization amongst young adults and youth.
Right. So, I mean, there are numerous opportunities for doing that, but I think I really think that, some of the most significant organizing happens in communities. So it's not kind of state-led. They happen from the ground up. And in fact, there was that beautiful line from Eric Ward about democracy. Where was that beautiful line I wrote down somewhere about how democracy is from the ground up. Democracy lives through the people. It doesn't live through kind of state institutions as such. And I think that that's true of this organizing. So this moment really does call for mobilization. And I think that that's the lesson of the moment, is that we can't rely on statist interventions to produce the kind of world that we want to produce. The kind of world that we want to produce is really being cultivated and crafted in the everyday actions of people on the ground. And I mean, at best, I think what states can do is, things like basic income grants, for instance, for young people in particular. So, so that there's, so that they have the space to be in the world and to learn and to organize in a way that they might not have now. But really, what we see in Canada is organizing from the ground up that has had the most significant outcomes for kind of anti-racist mobilizing. And can I quickly mention, just very quickly, the encampment example from the University of Toronto. It was one of the longest standing encampments for Free Palestine, the People's Circle for Palestine, it was called, and one of the largest in the world. And these young people were so inspiring in their organizing in this encampment. They kind of, when I was organizing in South Africa, we had a kind of stages logic of organizing and emancipation. And what these young people have today is they organized with kind of Palestine at the center of their mobilization, because that's the most immediate issue. But the ways in which they organized themselves was based on anti-racism, anti-sexism, they like really kind of cultivated a community within the encampment that sought to produce the kind of world that they were imagining. And so, they're those kinds of examples that I think are examples that we can look to.
I mean, so thank you for that, and especially the last comment, because and Prof. Mbembe, I hope you forgive me, I'm going to give you a bit of a curveball question here. And it's mostly about this notion, if this topic is really about global leadership in this rising age of polarization, and we're thinking about the next generation of leaders, and we're seeing a tendency amongst the next generation who are seemingly reinvigorated by resistance, right? And resisting in a manner that we haven't seen before, resisting in a manner that goes against liberal norms, resisting in a manner that goes against kind of societal beliefs of the last 30 years around how do you engage in debate. But that form of resistance can equally polarize as well. And the question then becomes, how do you reconcile this new style of leadership amongst young people? Melissa talked about the encampment. We had our own situation with Rhodes Must Fall, where we decided that we are going to, on purpose, agitate. We're not here for dialogue. And that created huge problems, huge successes, but huge problems. And I'm curious, Prof. Mbembe, in this polarized world, what is this importance of leadership? Should it just be resistance that polarizes, or should it be resistance that brings people together? We've also got until 22. I've negotiated with the powers that be. So we've got a few more minutes. Thanks, Prof.
Look, I think it should be the kind forms of mobilization and leadership we need are those that help to build large coalitions. Because historically, these are the forms of arrangements which have helped us to achieve a modicum of success. Of course, one understands that this is all dialectical, that in order to be counted, in order for one's voice to be heard, one needs to strengthen, achieve a modicum of power. That is a power game that is at work. And that in order to be listened to, one needs to be a force. And that moment of constituting oneself as a force necessarily includes some form or the other of polarization. But it's dialectical in the sense that whatever is achieved through polarization has to be converted into a real voice, a voice that counts, that cannot be discounted. I'm afraid that we will not get to where we really want to get. So that's for the more political, strategic, tactical part of the issue. I think Eric said something at the end of his earlier intervention, which requires that we go back to it a little bit. Because it seems to me that there are 2 or 3 big questions our world now is facing. The first one, which is a very old question, has been there all along. Melissa recalled it to us a moment ago through her historical description. The first one has to do with the question of to whom is it that the earth we live in, to whom does it belong? Who owns it? Who has legitimate claims to own it? Which means to dominate it, to exploit it, and to enjoy the benefits of that exploitation. So the question of the repartitioning of the earth is what we are witnessing right now. That's what was at the basis of Marco Rubio's speech in Berlin. The second question, which is, of course, has connections with the first, has to do with what I would call mobility regimes. Who has the right to move in an earth that has been partitioned? Not so long ago, the idea was that commodities should move freely. Humans shouldn't. They should be subjected to a whole set of restrictions. And in the regime of restrictions, some were allowed to move faster, more than others. As far as we Africans are concerned, of course, we're, as usual, at the bottom. It was understood that we shouldn't be moving. In some instances, like in Gaza, in Palestine in particular, it was accepted that they shouldn't even, the possibility of moving shouldn't even be considered at all. And that's why Gaza was called an open prison. And we know what has happened there of late: containment, immobilization, and distraction. I am not sure that this is a modality only those who live in Gaza might have to face of what might be coming elsewhere. So you have those 2 things. To whom is it that the world belongs, and who has the right to move and who doesn't? In our history in Africa, mobility has been a very difficult issue in the history of freedom in Africa, in the sense that whenever we have been able to move, we have been moving in shackles. And therefore, the challenge is whether or not we can move freely, at least in our own continent. And that's why questions of xenophobia and all that comes with it are so fundamental. And of course, as I said early on, the question of xenophobia, in particular in South Africa, has to be understood in relation to the imperative of redress. But redress in an Africa that is interconnected, in which the citizenship, belonging, those concepts have to be extended. They should be extended, including to our diasporas and to those who want to tie their fate with our continent, beyond markers of race, ethnicity, religion, and so forth and so on. So it seems to me that, I'll end there, that is the kind of big idea we have to come up with and articulate our struggles to those big ideas. And in that sense, South Africa, once again, is an incredible example why is it that Washington is harassing South Africa right now? Because in the current white supremacist paradigm, it represents a scandal. It's a scandal in the sense that it stands in its deep core, the core, Kathrada, Sisulu, and the others, against transactionalism. But in a subjective level, it's even more scandalous. It is the only place on earth where a substantive white minority is under black rule, which is a total scandal for those who want to turn our history back to colonialism and racism. So that's what I believe, Professor Chikane, and I'll stop there.
I mean, thank you so much, Prof, especially that last particular line, which I think has resonated with many in the room. I want to say a thank you from my side to Dr. Ashwini, Eric Ward, Dr. Levin, and Prof. Mbembe. This has been an invigorating conversation, and I wish it could be 2 hours in total. But I want to thank you for your time, your efforts, your contributions. This has been recorded, if I'm not mistaken, or it's being streamed somewhere. It will be shared amongst our networks because I think there's a lot for people to learn from here. But that's enough from my side, and I hand over to Ritabile.
Thank you so much, Dr. Chikane. I think you've shared that we have recorded this conversation. I think what has been discussed today offers ample opportunity for reflection. So we will make sure that we share not only the recording, but the links that Mr. Ward has also shared within the chat box. So just to thank everyone, we've had really important conversations tonight, and I think we've been reminded not only of the challenges we face in South Africa, but across the world, but also that we're not isolated in the challenges we face in South Africa, and that they are deeply connected, shaped by histories, powers, and narratives that we choose whether to uphold or challenge. And I think today's discussion has shown us that rising polarization, the growth of right-wing populism, and the persistence of racism and exclusion require more than analysis, but deeper courage and value-driven leadership. A leadership that is rooted in justice, dignity, and an unwavering commitment to building societies that are both inclusive and humane. So I hope that we leave this space not with all the answers, but sharper questions, deeper understanding, and a renewed sense of responsibility for each of us, because we all have a role to play, whether that's in our communities, our institutions, our personal life, to actively resist division and to advance social cohesion and belonging amongst us all. So also on behalf of the Ahmed Kathrada Foundation, I would like to extend our sincerest gratitude to the keynote speaker, Dr. Ashwini KP, for grounding us in the global human rights framework and reminding us of the urgency of confronting racism in all its forms. Our heartfelt thanks goes also to our esteemed panelists, Mr. Eric Ward, Dr. Melissa Levine, Professor Ashile Mbembe, for bringing rich global perspectives that have helped us understand how these dynamics manifest across different contexts, while also drawing important parallels to South Africa's context. Also to our moderator, Dr. Kgotsofetse Chikane, thank you so much for guiding this conversation with thoughtfulness, clarity, and depth, and for ensuring that the dialogue remained both engaging and impactful. And we extend also our appreciation to everyone who has joined us today. Your presence, your questions, and your willingness to engage critically are really what makes spaces like this meaningful and necessary, and that we hope in the next coming months would offer, as the Ahmed Kathrada Foundation, more opportunities for us to reflect on the strategies that were shared today, but also to ask these questions and deepen our own understanding about the role that we can play in making South Africa and the world a better place. So thank you so much to everyone. Enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.